June 14, 2024, the day the war changed without anyone noticing. Let me tell you something that should have been front-page news but wasn't. On that quiet Friday, Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu stood before a room of generals and announced something that, on the surface, sounded like standard wartime Russia has achieved a strategic advantage in Ukraine. Most Western media outlets dismissed it as propaganda, another empty boast from a regime that's been losing ground for months, or so we've been told. But here's the I've spent the last 3 decades studying Russian military doctrine, and when Moscow uses the phrase strategic advantage, it's not just rhetoric. It's a coded signal. And if you know how to read it, you'll see that Shoigu wasn't just talking about Ukraine. He was talking about the entire global balance of power. Now, before we go any further, let me establish something up front. I'm not a Kremlin apologist. I don't believe in the Russia is invincible myth any more than I buy into the Ukraine is winning fairy tale. What I do believe in is evidence, patterns, and the cold, hard calculus of great power politics. And right now, the evidence suggests that we're witnessing something far more dangerous than a stalled counteroffensive or a frozen conflict. We're watching the early stages of a fundamental shift in the world order, one that the West, in its arrogance, still refuses to acknowledge. So let's start with the official narrative, the story they want you to believe. The official Russia is losing, Ukraine is winning, and the West holds all the cards. If you've been following mainstream Western media over the past year, you've heard the same Russia is bogged down in Ukraine, its economy is crippled by sanctions, its military is running out of men and material, and Ukraine, with enough Western support, will eventually push the invaders back to the 1991 borders. The Pentagon, the State Department, and NATO officials have all reinforced this line. Just last month, a senior U.S. defense official told reporters, the Russians have suffered over 500,000 casualties, killed and wounded combined. Their offensive capabilities are degraded. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel for recruits. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has repeatedly assured his people and his Western backers that victory is within reach, provided the flow of weapons and money continues. The data seems to support this. Open-source intelligence groups like Oryx have documented staggering Russian equipment losses, over 15,000 armored vehicles, 300 aircraft, and 2,000 tanks destroyed or captured since February 2022. Western sanctions have, by most accounts, crippled Russia's ability to produce advanced weaponry, forcing it to rely on Soviet-era stockpiles and imports from North Korea and Iran. The ruble has fluctuated wildly, inflation has spiked, and Putin's approval ratings, while still high, have shown signs of erosion in some polls. Then there's the battlefield. After Ukraine's much-hyped 2023 counteroffensive failed to break through Russian lines, Western analysts began whispering about stalemate. But even in that failure, the narrative Russia was bleeding, Ukraine was resilient, and time was on Kyiv's side. The West just needed to hold the line, keep the weapons flowing, and eventually, Moscow would collapse under the weight of its own incompetence. But here's the problem with this: it's not just incomplete. It's dangerously misleading. Deconstructing what the data and the Russians are really saying. Let's start with the casualty numbers. Yes, Russia has taken horrendous losses, no one disputes that. But here's what the Pentagon isn't telling: Russia has also replaced those losses at a rate that should alarm anyone paying attention. In 2023 alone, Moscow mobilized over 400,000 new troops, many of them through a combination of conscription, voluntary enlistment, and covert mobilization. The Wagner mutiny last summer? A blip. The Russian military has since absorbed Wagner's forces, purged unreliable elements, and restructured its command to prevent future insurrections. Today, Russia's frontline manpower in Ukraine is larger than it was at the start of the war. Then there's the equipment. The 15,000 armored vehicles lost? Most of those were Soviet-era T-72s and BMPs, machines Russia has been producing since the 1970s. Meanwhile, Russia's defense industry has shifted to a wartime footing, churning out new T-90M tanks, modernized artillery systems, and long-range drones at a pace that has caught Western intelligence off guard. In 2023, Russia produced more artillery shells than the entire NATO alliance combined. And while the West pats itself on the back for sending Ukraine a few dozen F-16s, Russia has been fielding its fifth-generation Su-57 stealth fighters and hypersonic Kinzhal missiles, systems that no Western military has ever faced in combat. Now, let's talk about the economy. The ruble is volatile, but Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023, faster than the Eurozone. Sanctions have hurt, but they've also forced Russia to develop self-sufficiency in key sectors. Moscow has rerouted its energy exports to China and India, its trade with the global south has surged, and its military-industrial complex is now the most dynamic sector of its economy. Meanwhile, the West's own economic vulnerabilities, rising debt, inflation, and energy shortages have been exposed by the very sanctions it imposed on Russia. But here's where it gets really interesting. When Shoigu spoke of a strategic advantage, he wasn't just talking about Ukraine. He was talking about the bigger picture, the global balance of power. And if you listen to retired U.S. Army Colonel Douglas, the Russians are not fighting this war the way we think they are. They're not trying to take and hold territory in the Western sense. They're grinding down Ukraine's military while methodically degrading NATO's ability to sustain the fight. And they're winning. Let me translate that: for Russia's strategy isn't about capturing Kyiv or even all of Donbass. It's about attrition, wearing down Ukraine's manpower, economy, and Western support until Kyiv is forced to negotiate on Moscow's terms. And on that front, the data is Ukraine's losses are even more severe than Russia's. Western estimates suggest Ukraine has lost between 200,000 and 300,000 killed and wounded, nearly half its pre-war military. Its population is shrinking due to mass emigration, its economy is in freefall, and its infrastructure is being systematically destroyed. Meanwhile, NATO's stockpiles are running low, European unity is fraying, and the US is facing a political crisis over continued funding. So when Shoigu says Russia has a strategic advantage, he's not lying. He's stating a fact. And if the West doesn't wake up to this reality soon, it's going to be in for a very rude awakening. The bigger how Ukraine became the front line of a new Cold War. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of global power and the West's desperate, and ultimately futile, attempt to preserve a unipolar world that no longer exists. For the past 30 years, the United States has operated under the assumption that it could maintain its dominance indefinitely. The Soviet Union collapsed, China was still rising, and the world was supposed to remain a US-led liberal order. But that order was always a myth. The reality is that great powers don't accept permanent subordination. And Russia, humiliated by NATO action, economic shock therapy, and the color revolutions of the 2000s, has been pushing back for years. Ukraine was the final straw. From Moscow's perspective, this war isn't just about territory. It's about spheres of influence, a concept the West claims to reject but has always practiced. The Monroe Doctrine, anyone? The US has spent the last century ensuring that no rival power could challenge its dominance in the Western Hemisphere. Russia is doing the same in its near abroad. And while the West frames this as imperialism, the truth is that every great power in history has sought to control its periphery. The difference is that the US has been able to do it with impunity, while Russia is being punished for trying. Then there's China. Beijing has watched this war closely, and what it sees is a West that is overstretched, divided, and increasingly unable to project power. The US is bogged down in Ukraine, distracted by Taiwan, and struggling to maintain its alliances in the face of rising nationalism. Meanwhile, Russia and China are deepening their strategic partnership, forging a de facto alliance that assesses energy, technology, and military cooperation. The recent joint naval exercises in the South China Sea? The $400 billion gas deal? The coordinated diplomatic efforts to peel off US allies in the global South? This isn't just cooperation. It's the foundation of a new multipolar order. And that's the real fear in Washington. Not that Russia will win in Ukraine, but that the war will accelerate the decline of US hegemony. Because if Russia can defy the West, survive sanctions, and emerge stronger, what's to stop China from doing the same in Taiwan? What's to stop Iran, North Korea, or even India from challenging US dominance in their regions? This is why the war in Ukraine has become existential for both sides. For Russia, it's about survival, proving that it can resist Western pressure and secure its borders. For the US, it's about proving that the unipolar moment isn't over, that it can still dictate the rules of the international system. And that's why neither side can afford to lose.
The military, why the West is playing a losing game.
Now, let's talk about the military situation on the ground, because this is where the West's delusions are most dangerous.
Right now, Russia holds roughly 18% of Ukraine's pre-2014 territory.
But here's the key: that 18% includes some of the most strategically vital regions, Donbass, Crimea, and the land bridge connecting them.
These aren't just symbolic gains. They're defensible gains.
Russia has spent the last 2 years fortifying these areas with multi-layered defenses, trenches, minefields, artillery, and air defenses that make them nearly impregnable to conventional assault. Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive, which was supposed to break through these lines, failed spectacularly, costing Kyiv tens of thousands of troops and hundreds of Western-supplied armored vehicles.
And yet, the West keeps doubling down on the same failed strategy.
More HIMARS, more Leopard tanks, more F-16s, none of which have changed the fundamental dynamic of the war.
Why? Because this isn't a war of maneuver.
It's a war of attrition, and in a war of attrition, the side with the deeper resources, the stronger economy, and the greater political will always wins.
And right now, that side is Russia. Let me be on not saying Russia is invincible.
Its military has made mistakes, horrific ones. The initial invasion was a disaster, its logistics are still shaky, and its command structure has been plagued by infighting. But here's the thing about great: they learn.
They adapt. And Russia has adapted faster than the West expected. Take electronic warfare, for example.
In the early days of the war, Ukraine's drones and precision-guided munitions wreaked havoc on Russian forces. But today, Russia has deployed some of the most advanced electronic warfare systems in the world, jamming GPS signals, disrupting communications, and even hacking into Ukrainian drones mid-flight. Meanwhile, Ukraine's vaunted IT army has been neutralized by Russian cyber defenses, and its much-touted digital battlefield has been reduced to a patchwork of outdated systems. Then there's the air war. The West keeps promising that F-16s will turn the tide, but the reality is that Ukraine's air force is a shadow of what it was in 2022. Russia has shot down dozens of Ukrainian jets and helicopters, and its air defenses, including the S-400 and S-500 systems, have made it nearly impossible for Ukraine to operate its remaining aircraft. The F-16s, when they finally arrive, will be flying into a meat grinder.
And the West knows it. But the biggest problem isn't the weapons. It's the strategy.
The US and NATO are still fighting this war like it's 1991, like they can bomb a country into submission, install a puppet government, and call it a day.
But Russia isn't Iraq. It isn't Libya.
It's a nuclear-armed great power with a population of 140 million, a vast industrial base, and a leadership that has shown it's willing to endure immense pain to achieve its goals. And that's the part that should terrify anyone paying attention. Because if the West keeps pushing, if it keeps escalating, if it keeps refusing to negotiate, we're not just risking a Ukrainian defeat. We're risking a direct conflict between NATO and Russia. And that's a war no one can win. The domestic how US politics is distorting the war. Now, let's talk about the elephant in the American politics. Because this war isn't just about geopolitics. It's about domestic politics and the incentives that are driving the US to keep pouring billions into a conflict it can't win. Right now, the Biden administration is caught between two impossible choices. On one hand, it can't afford to lose Ukraine, not with an election looming and Republicans accusing it of weakness. On the other hand, it can't afford to win either, because a Ukrainian victory would require a level of escalation that risks nuclear war.
So what does it do? It kicks the can down the road.
It sends just enough weapons to keep Ukraine fighting, but not enough to actually win. It talks tough about standing with Kyiv, but refuses to give Ukraine the long-range missiles or air power it needs to strike deep into Russia.
And that's the real tragedy. Because this isn't a strategy. It's theater.
It's about making the American people feel like they're doing something, even if that something is just prolonging the suffering of the Ukrainian people. Then there's the role of the military-industrial complex. The US has spent over $100 billion on this war so far, and the defense contractors are loving it. Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, they're all posting record profits. And they have powerful allies in Congress, where defense lobbyists spend millions every year to ensure that the money keeps flowing. Meanwhile, the American people are footing the bill, while their own infrastructure crumbles and their social services are gutted. But the most dangerous part of this dynamic is the way it's being weaponized for partisan politics. The Republicans, who once opposed endless wars, are now using Ukraine as a cudgel against Biden, accusing him of weakness while simultaneously blocking aid packages. The Democrats, meanwhile, are using the war to paint the GOP as Putin's puppets, even as they refuse to engage in any serious debate about the war's goals or costs. And that's how you get a situation where no one in Washington is willing to ask the hard what is the endgame here? How does this war end? And at what cost? Because right now, the answer no one knows. And that's a recipe for disaster. Scenario: how this ends. So where does this go from here? Let's run through the scenarios, because none of them are pretty. Scenario 1: the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war drags on for years, with neither side able to deliver a knockout blow. Russia consolidates its gains in the east and south, Ukraine becomes a permanent ward of the west, and the front lines stabilize into a new Iron Curtain. This is the most likely outcome if the US continues its current strategy of just enough support for Ukraine. The problem? It's unsustainable. Ukraine's economy collapses, its population flees, and the West grows tired of footing the bill. Eventually, Kiev is forced to negotiate, but by then, the terms will be even worse than they are today. Scenario 2: the Ukrainian collapse. This is the scenario no one in the West wants to talk about, but it's the most likely. Ukraine's manpower is exhausted, its economy is in ruins, and Western support is drying up. Russia, meanwhile, keeps grinding forward, capturing more territory and forcing Kiev to the negotiating table. The US and Europe, facing their own domestic crises, cut their losses and abandon Ukraine to its fate. The result? A Russian victory, a humiliated West, and a new era of Russian dominance in Eastern Europe. This is the scenario that keeps me up at night, because it's not just a Ukrainian defeat, it's a Western defeat. Scenario 3: the escalation spiral. This is the nightmare scenario. The West, desperate to avoid defeat, escalates, sending long-range missiles, deploying NATO troops, or even imposing a no-fly zone. Russia, facing an existential threat, responds with tactical nuclear weapons. The US, caught off guard, retaliates. And before anyone knows what's happening, we're in a full-scale nuclear war. This scenario is unlikely, but it's not impossible. And the fact that we're even talking about it should tell you how dangerous this situation has become. Now, I want to be none of these outcomes are good. But the longer the West refuses to acknowledge reality, the worse they'll get. And right now, reality is staring us in the asterisk. Russia is winning. Not in the way Putin dreamed of when he launched this invasion, no grand victory parade in Kiev, no swift collapse of Ukrainian resistance, but in the slow, grinding way wars are often by attrition, by endurance, by the willingness to absorb pain that your adversary cannot. And what most people don't realize is that Russia's so-called strategic advantage isn't just about territory or firepower. It's about the fundamental asymmetry in how Moscow and the West approach this war. Let me explain why this matters. When I listen to Western officials talk about holding the line or degrading Russian capabilities, I hear the same kind of magical thinking that got us here in the first place. They act as if political will is a renewable resource, as if the American public will tolerate an open-ended commitment to a war that has no clear path to victory. Meanwhile, Putin has spent the last 2 decades preparing Russia for this exact conflict, not just militarily, but psychologically. The Russian state has conditioned its population to accept sacrifice in a way that Western democracies, with their short election cycles and consumerist cultures, simply cannot replicate. Here's the uncomfortable: Russia's economy isn't collapsing. Yes, sanctions hurt, but they've been far less effective than advertised. The ruble is stable, energy revenues are flowing through alternative markets, and Russia's defense industry is operating at full capacity. In 2023 alone, Moscow produced more artillery shells than the entire Western alliance combined. That's not just a statistic, it's a death sentence for Ukraine's ability to hold the line. And while the US debates whether to send another $60 billion aid package, Russia is outproducing NATO in drones, missiles, and armored vehicles. This isn't a temporary setback for Moscow, it's a structural advantage.
Now, what really keeps me up at night isn't just the battlefield imbalance.
It's the way the West has misdiagnosed the nature of this war from the beginning. We treated it as a moral crusade, a battle between democracy and autocracy, when in reality, it's a brutal, old-school war of national survival for Russia. Putin isn't fighting for ideology, he's fighting for what he sees as Russia's rightful place in the world. And when a nation believes its existence is at stake, it will outlast any adversary that sees the conflict as a policy choice rather than an existential struggle. Take the manpower issue, for example.
Ukraine's losses are catastrophic.
Estimates vary, but most credible sources suggest Kyiv has suffered between 150,000 and 200,000 killed in action, with another 300,000 wounded.
That's a casualty rate that would break any Western army. But Russia?
They've lost more, somewhere between 300,000 and 400,000 dead, but they have a population of 140 million and a culture that glorifies sacrifice in war.
The Kremlin can afford to lose men in a way that Ukraine, with its shrinking population and collapsing birth rate, cannot.
And let's not Russia has already mobilized over 300,000 reservists, with another 150,000 expected this year.
Ukraine, on the other hand, is running out of bodies. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40. That's not a fighting force, that's a death march.
Then there's the question of Western resolve.
The US has spent over $100 billion on this war, and for what?
A stalemate that benefits no one but the arms manufacturers.
Europe, meanwhile, is fracturing. Hungary blocks aid packages. Slovakia elects a pro-Russian government.
Germany, once the backbone of European support for Ukraine, is now debating whether to send Taurus missiles, a move that would escalate the conflict but do little to change the outcome.
And let's not forget the elephant in the 2024 US election. If Trump wins, Ukraine's lifeline is cut.
If Biden wins, he'll be a lame duck with a Congress that's already turning against the war.
Either way, the money dries up. So where does that leave us?
Right back to the three scenarios I laid out earlier, but with one critical: the window for a negotiated settlement is closing. The longer the West clings to the fantasy of a Ukrainian victory, the worse the terms will be when reality finally sets in. And make no mistake, reality will set in.
It always does.
Here's what a realistic settlement might look: Ukraine cedes Crimea and the Donbass, agrees to neutrality, and receives security guarantees from NATO, but not membership.
Russia, in turn, withdraws from the rest of occupied Ukraine and pays reparations.
It's not pretty, but it's better than a collapsed Ukrainian state, a resurgent Russia, and a humiliated West that just spent a decade proving it can't project power beyond its borders.
The problem is that no one in Washington or Brussels wants to admit this. They'd rather keep feeding the war machine than face the political fallout of defeat. But wars don't care about political fallout.
They care about power, about will, about who can endure the most pain.
And right now, Russia is winning that contest.
Not because they're stronger, but because they're willing to accept a level of suffering that the West cannot.
So what happens next? If I had to bet, I'd say we're heading toward scenario 2, the Ukrainian collapse.
Not because Russia is invincible, but because the West has already lost the will to fight.
And when that happens, the geopolitical consequences will be far worse than anyone in Washington is prepared to admit. Because this isn't just about Ukraine.
It's about the future of NATO, the credibility of American power, and whether the 21st century will be defined by Western dominance or by a new era of Russian-Chinese hegemony. And that, my friends, is the real strategic advantage Russia has already secured. Not on the battlefield, but in the minds of the men who decide when to fight and when to fold.
The question: will the West realize it before it's too late? Or will we keep sleepwalking toward disaster, one aid package at a time? Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy failure, it's a domestic political time bomb. And the fuse is already lit.
Let me explain why this matters for the average American or European citizen who might be tuning in, thinking this is just another distant war.
Because it's not.
The consequences of this conflict are already reshaping the political landscape at home in ways that will define the next decade, whether we like it or not.
Take the United States first.
The Biden administration has tied itself to this war in a way that leaves no room for retreat. Every time they send another $60 billion aid package to Kyiv, they're not just betting on Ukraine, they're betting on their own political survival.
And that's a dangerous gamble. The American public is exhausted.
Inflation is still gnawing at household budgets, the border crisis is a daily news cycle disaster, and now we're being told we have to keep funding a war that, by the Pentagon's own admission, Ukraine cannot win. The polling is a majority of Americans, including a growing number of Democrats, want to see a negotiated end to this conflict.
But the White House can't admit that because it would mean admitting defeat.
And in Washington, defeat is the one thing no one can afford to acknowledge. Here's the uncomfortable: the longer this drags on, the more the political center in America fractures. On the right, you have figures like Donald Trump and J.D. Vance openly questioning the blank check approach to Ukraine, framing it as a distraction from domestic priorities. On the left, progressives like Bernie Sanders and the Squad are increasingly vocal about the need to rein in military spending and push for diplomacy.
And in the middle? A silent majority that's just waiting for someone to offer them a way out.
The problem is, the establishment in both parties has painted themselves into a corner.
They've staked their credibility on this war, and now they're trapped. Admitting failure would be political suicide. But doubling down risks something: a backlash so severe it could reshape American politics for a generation. Look at the 2024 election.
Trump's entire campaign is built on the idea that the Biden administration has wasted American resources on a lost cause. And he's not wrong, just incomplete. The real issue isn't just the money, it's the lack of a coherent strategy.
The White House keeps insisting that Ukraine can win if we just send more weapons, but they can't explain how.
Meanwhile, Trump is positioning himself as the only leader willing to cut a deal with Putin, even if that deal is messy and unpalatable.
The irony? He might be the only one with the political capital to do it. Because if Biden tried to negotiate now, he'd be crucified by his own party. The neocons and liberal interventionists who dominate the Democratic foreign policy establishment would never forgive him. And the Republicans?
They'd use it as proof that the Democrats are weak on national security.
But here's the: this isn't just about 2024. It's about what comes after. If Ukraine collapses, and I believe it will, the political fallout in the US will be catastrophic. The neocons will blame the isolationists. The isolationists will blame the neocons. And the American people? They'll blame everyone. We've seen this movie before.
Vietnam didn't just end in Saigon, it ended with Watergate, with the Church Committee, with a generation of Americans who lost faith in their government. Afghanistan didn't just end with the Taliban retaking Kabul, it ended with a crisis of confidence in American power that we're still grappling with today.
Ukraine will be worse because the stakes are higher. This isn't just about a failed state in Central Asia or a proxy war in Southeast Asia.
This is about the future of NATO, the credibility of the dollar, and whether the US can still shape global events or if we're just another declining power clinging to the past.
Now, let's talk about Europe.
The situation there is even more precarious because the political dynamics are different.
In the US, the debate is about whether to keep funding the war. In Europe, it's about whether to keep fighting it. And the cracks are already showing. Take Germany. Olaf Scholz's government is caught between a rock and a hard place. The German public is increasingly skeptical of the war.
Energy prices are still high, industry is struggling, and now they're being told they have to prepare for a long-term confrontation with Russia. The far-right alternative for Germany is surging in the polls, and even the center-right is starting to question the wisdom of endless military support for Ukraine.
Scholz knows this. That's why he's been so cautious about sending Taurus missiles. He's terrified of being dragged into a direct conflict with Russia.
But his caution is being interpreted as weakness, both by his domestic opponents and by Washington.
Then there's France. Emmanuel Macron has been the most hawkish of the European leaders, even floating the idea of sending NATO troops to Ukraine. But Macron's position is fragile.
The French public is deeply divided, and his approval ratings are in the gutter. If Ukraine collapses, his political career could go with it.
And let's not forget the rest of Europe.
Hungary's Viktor Orbán has already made it clear he won't support further aid packages.
Slovakia's Robert Fico is following suit. Even Poland, which has been one of Ukraine's staunchest allies, is starting to waver as the economic costs mount. The European Union is supposed to be a united front, but it's anything but. And that disunity is Russia's greatest asset. So what happens when the music stops? Let's game out the scenarios.
If Ukraine collapses in the next 6 to 12 months, and I believe it will, the political fallout in Europe will be immediate.
The far right will surge across the continent, framing the war as a failure of the liberal elite.
The center-left and center-right will scramble to distance themselves from the policies that led to this disaster.
And the EU? It will be paralyzed by infighting.
The European project was built on the idea of peace and prosperity. But if Ukraine falls, it will be a stark reminder that Europe is neither peaceful nor prosperous. And that's a narrative that plays right into the hands of the populists. In the US, the collapse of Ukraine will be a gut punch to the establishment.
The neocons will blame Trump.
The progressives will blame the military-industrial complex.
And the American people?
They'll blame both parties.
The 2024 election will be a referendum on the war, and the winner will be the candidate who can offer a way out. But here's the there is no way out that doesn't involve humiliation. Because the only way to end this war is to admit that we lost. And in Washington, that's the one thing no one is willing to do. Let me be this isn't about whether Ukraine deserves to survive. It's about whether the West has the political will to keep fighting a war it cannot win. And right now, the answer is no.
The American public is tired. The European public is divided. And the political class in both places is too invested in the status quo to change course. That's why Russia has the strategic advantage. They don't need to win on the battlefield. They just need to wait until the West loses the will to fight. And that moment is coming sooner than anyone in Washington or Brussels wants to admit.
So what's the endgame? If I had to predict, I'd say we're heading toward a messy, protracted stalemate that ends with a negotiated settlement on Russia's terms.
Ukraine will cede territory.
NATO will promise not to EXD.
And the West will declare victory while licking its wounds.
But the real damage will be done at home.
The political center in America and Europe will fracture.
The far right will gain ground. And the liberal international order that has defined the post-Cold War era will be left in tatters. Because this war wasn't just about Ukraine.
It was about whether the West still has the power to shape the world in its image.
And the answer, it turns out, is no.